Hello everyone, my name is Alex, and this is Zombie Side Up, where whatever pops into my tiny cranium is sculpted into what I hope to be a mediocre at best work of art. I recently came upon a picture of an inflatable balloon man, and it got me thinking, as most would, why does the inflatable balloon man look nothing like a real man? So today, we're gonna fix that. The first thing I did was I got a wooden stand out that I could then drill 2 holes into so that I can put the armature into the stand when it is finished. To make the armature, I took 2 pieces of wire that I first test fitted into the holes to make sure that the wire was the right size. I then wrapped them together and started to shape it into the correct shape of an inflatable balloon man that is waving around. After the armature was completed, I then got a thinner gauge of wire, which was used to create the place where the arms will go on the sculpture. And with that, the armature was ready. Now before I add clay onto any armature, I always make sure to buff out the big portions of the sculpture with aluminum foil. However, I was running low at this point in time, so I got out some of my extra gum wrapper stores that I could then wrap into the foil, and then I used that to put the aluminum foil on the sculpture. Now, I am pretty sure this is totally fine to cook in the oven and add into a sculpture, but don't count on it. I do not know for sure, so but yeah, it worked. Anyways, after that I then got a bunch of clay, wrapped it all around, smoothed it all out. I didn't make you watch that because it is a pretty boring task, but once the clay is on there, a base layer, then the fun starts because I was able to start adding in all the lumps and rolls to the body of this realistic inflatable balloon man. The next thing I did was I added a pair of manly pecs that would make sure this realistic inflatable balloon man looks like a real man. After that, I worked on making sure that the fold lines where the neck folds off to the side are pretty obvious. So I added on some thin snakes of clay, but then I also used a ball stylus to indent these crease lines into the armature. So it was a mix of both, and it ended up looking really good. Although it does take a lot of time, and you have to be careful not to squish any of those because they are very thin and it's very easy to mess up those details. The next thing though was a lot easier. I first added a snake of clay around the base because I sort of wanted to make it look like there were a bunch of tentacly things going off from the bottom of the sculpture and into the wood base. So to do that, I first smoothed it all out. I started to sort of rough out where I wanted the different tentacles to go, and after that I used a ball stylus to finish up the look. Now, what is a man without his eyes? So I got my ball stylus and started to poke some holes into the head so that I could then drop in some pre-cooked balls that would make up the look of the eye. After that, I got some short snakes of clay that I used to rough out the shape of the eyelids. But the real magic and what really makes it pop is when I use the smoothing tool to blend the eyelids into the sculpture. That definitely amps it up a little. And then I also used one of my silicone tools to push up the eyelids just a little bit to make it look like a little bit more realistic. After that, I cut out the rough shape of the mouth, and I took out a lot of that clay, but I will end up adding clay back in, as you see now. And that's because I wanted to make sure there was just a very thin layer, and so the mouth could go in as far as possible. If I wanted it to go in farther, what I should have done is I should have made the foil under that part of the armature a lot less. There should have been a lot less foil, but I didn't do that, and to be honest, I think it looks really good. I kind of kept more of that like unrealistic feel of the inflatable balloon man when it comes to the mouth, just because it doesn't go in as far as a real man's mouth would. After all those steps, I would say that the inflatable balloon man that has been realistified is looking pretty good. I do need to add on the arms, but before I do that, I want to bake the sculpture so that I don't squish any of the details in the future. So the first thing I do is I give it an isopropyl alcohol bath to smooth out all the fingerprints and other rough areas, and after that I can bake it and then start working on the arms. Now for the arms, I first wrap them in a very thin wire that helps to hold the clay in place when it is put on the arms. Whenever I make arms, the first step I have is to get a snake of clay, cut it down the middle so that I can then squish it over the wire. I then add on the elbows, smooth everything together, and it's time to work on the hands. Now for the hands, this time I made hands with actual wires sticking out for the fingers, which does definitely make it easy, but it does take some time. And I'm happy to say, after all that, and making a little sign off camera, the sculpting was done, and it is time for painting. The first step in the painting process was to add a base coat of a skin tone onto the sculpture, because we are trying to make a realistic man here. I then added on some lighter skin tones to highlight those raised areas. Afterwards, I added some black onto the nails because I thought that would definitely add a little bit of a realistic or gross look to the nails and hands. Afterwards, I added some red into the mouth, I painted the teeth white, and then I grossed them up a little with a brown wash that I then dabbed away to add that gross teeth look. Now, because I went the no planning route when it came to making this sculpture, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with the eyes until I just went straight into it and decided to make them all black. And I think a big reason for this is I didn't want to go and do a first white base coat over those eyes and then add black, colors, so I just decided to put black over it. Made it a little easier, but it definitely did take away a little bit from that realistic man look. But after adding the UV resin on and seeing how shiny they were, they definitely look really good, and I'm actually kind of happy with that decision. Now, once the camera focuses back in again, you can see that the eyes are looking pretty good with this UV resin. I always use UV resin on my eyes as that adds an extra shine, and it is very easy to control where you're putting the UV resin. And after covering both eyes, I then covered the mouth, and it was time to move on to the next step. After the completely, undeniably realistic man was created and painted, it was time to move on to painting the sign. Now for the sign, I used a very dark brown base coat, so that when I dry brushed on a lighter brown after this was dried, it ended up looking really good. And I think that's because it added a lot of shadows onto the sign, and overall, I think less is more, and that shows with this sculpture. Now you're probably wondering what I'm going to put on this sign, and because writing is hard, I decided to make a 3-letter word, gas, because I'm guessing this realistic inflatable balloon man must have come from a random gas station located out in the middle of the desert, and so that is the little story behind the sign. Now, after both sculptures were painted, both the sign and the undeniably completely realistic man, it was time to work on the sandification of the base. Now, for this sandification, I first had to add a bunch of glue onto the base so that the sand would not just fall off when I pick up the sculpture. And so I used one of my very used brushes that I don't like anymore to smear all the glue around. Now, after washing it, it did somehow retain some of its bristlelessness, but I don't know how many more glue smears it's got left in it, so that is up to us to see in the future. However, after all the glue was smeared around and I felt like there was a nice thin layer throughout the whole stand, I got out some of this sand that I had sourced from a very clean source. Also not really clean, I guess. It kind of smells sort of that like pond smell that's just been sitting, and so it's caked into the sand, so there isn't much we can do about it. But you guys don't have to smell it, so I mean, it looks good. Now, because I do not trust myself at all, I decided to have a second layer of protection for holding the sand down, and so I used a water glue liquid solution that I then pipetted over every single speck of sand to make it sure it was for sure held down onto the wooden sand. And this ended up working really good. It held everything very strongly in place. And that is good because I had about 5 close calls to where I almost dropped the stand in transition from the shelf to the desk. And with that, it's time to move on to those crisp final shots.